class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 14 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost 5-0. So coming into tonight's game, the Sharks were on a 2-game winning streak, and this was always going to be an extremely tough matchup. Not only were they hot off the heels from a tough and hard-fought victory against the Edmonton Oilers just about 24 hours ago, but they were also going from facing the worst team in the league, or at least tied for the worst team in the league, the Edmonton Oilers, to playing against the best team in the league and defending Stanley Cup champion Vegas Golden Knights, a franchise in which the Sharks have historically had trouble playing against, at least during the regular season. And so, any way you kind of looked at this one, it was going to be a very, very difficult win for the San Jose Sharks, and that was quite clear from what we saw on the ice here tonight from the Sharks. Now, strictly looking at the score, a 5-0 victory for the Vegas Golden Knights, one might think that there really isn't anything to review here from an analytical standpoint. It's kind of reminiscent to the game the Sharks had against the Tampa Bay Lightning a couple weeks back, where they lost 6-0 instead, a game in which I didn't really review any of the players playing, because it was a game in which the Sharks were dominated throughout 60 minutes. But that wasn't necessarily the case here tonight. Even if the score does look similar, this was a tale of two games for the San Jose Sharks, as we focus primarily, first of all, on the first couple of periods. And through the first and second periods of this game, the Sharks didn't necessarily look all that bad. Now, don't get me wrong, they were getting out-possessed significantly when it came to offensive zone time, as well as just generally outshot, but it was kind of the formula the Sharks had been using over these past couple of games compared to what they had been using through the first 11 games of the season, in which, yes, the Golden Knights were doubling up on shots against the Sharks here, at times even tripling up on shots, but not a ton of those opportunities were particularly dangerous. The Golden Knights would score only 2 of their 5 goals through the first 40 minutes of this game, and it should be noted that both of these goals, with some better goaltending, probably don't even go in. Perhaps the Martinez one still finds its way through to make it 1-0 Vegas, but the Pietrangelo one was just heavily overplayed by Kähkönen and probably shouldn't actually be a goal against from a above average goaltender, let's just say. So indeed, this score could have been even closer through 40 minutes. And while the Sharks weren't getting tons of chances in the early parts of this game, they did get a couple of here or there. Kunin came extremely close to scoring. Zetterlund as well came extremely close to scoring. So in a different universe, maybe this game is like 1-1 after 40 minutes. Maybe even a potential Sharks lead or something like that. But it did not end up being the case. The Sharks could not bury on the couple of chances that they had, and they could not get the saves on the couple of chances that the Golden Knights had. And then that brings us to the third period. This is indeed where we saw the Sharks of old, where the wheels came off, everything fell apart, and it was just disappointing to watch these last 20 minutes. Terrible defensive zone coverage, just awful plays here from the San Jose Sharks, and realistically, doesn't do any good just taking a look at these last 20 minutes of the game and trying to pull anything out of it. It was very reminiscent of like the 10-1 loss against the Canucks or the 10-2 loss against Pittsburgh. And so really, we're just going to be looking at these first couple of periods when it comes to talking about the players here tonight. And starting off with the top line, we have Eklund, Hertl, and Zetterlund. I've obviously praised this top line in each of the past couple of wins for the San Jose Sharks. Here tonight, they obviously had their hands full with the roles that they were being given in this one, so they did find themselves defending a lot in this game. Not doing a pretty bad job at defending, though. I thought they did an admirable job in the defensive zone, and when they got their opportunities, they got their offensive chances, they looked pretty good still and had a couple of nice cycles in this one. Eklund, I thought, had some really strong moments under pressure, which is one of the major weaknesses that I have pointed out at times in Eklund's game, where he will when he gets pressured by opposing teams' defenders, he is liable to make the wrong play in some of those situations. But here tonight, he was making a lot of the right play, which I thought was very cool to see. He was making some solid passes, even when there were a couple of defenders on him, not just one. And he was finding the open man time and time again. There was this one really nice pass, I believe, in the second period, like through the legs, that fed Hurdle for a great opportunity to get the Sharks on the board. It did not end up happening, but it was very, very close and very, very sneaky and creative from Eklund as well. When it comes to Hurdle's game, he definitely did not drop to where he was in the earlier parts of this season, but as I mentioned, an expected fall off facing off against a much, much, much better team here tonight. Still, though, I think he was a positive for the San Jose Sharks, and the same would go for Fabian Zetterlund, who continues to actually mesh very well with these two other, likely more skilled players, and is proving himself that he does indeed belong on this top line, at least for the time being. When it comes to the second line, we had a couple of switch-ups. So first of all, Cunnin, who was bumped from the fourth line to the second line in the second period of last night's game, ends up retaining that spot in the top six for whatever reason. And joining him on the other side is Filip Zadina, because Duclair seemingly was under the weather, maybe shaken up a bit in the Oilers game. So he ends up drawing out of the lineup. The only thing I know is that it was not a healthy scratch, and they are centered by Mikael Granlund. And let's start with Granlund, who I talked about in last night's game having a pretty good even strength showing, but a really, really awful power play performance. Speaking of the power play, it was once again terrible here tonight for the San Jose Sharks. They just can't seem to get anything rolling in the offensive zone at all. They're not even getting chances on net, it feels like, so that's not great. I don't know what kind of change-ups or shake-ups that they could possibly do. They've already made the trade for Calen Addison, a player who I will get to a bit later, and that hasn't really helped out this power play, and Granlund is perhaps one of the big reasons for that, because he has been looking rather bad in that situation. But when it comes to the even strength play, where Granlund wasn't all that terrible in the previous one, he was quite bad here tonight, had the terrible giveaway that led to the last Golden Knights goal that made it 5-0. Not exactly the end of the world, because the game was pretty much out of reach at that point anyway, but still not a good look for him. And while his line mates exactly didn't do him too many favors, I felt Granlund struggled multiple times here tonight. When it comes to his two wingers, Zadina, I thought looked okay-ish, but he seems to kind of just continue to be flying under the radar. Did score a goal in the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers, which was nice to see, but there doesn't really seem to be any great work happening in the offensive zone that really makes Zadina stand out in a super positive way. So it's hard to really foresee him fitting in long-term in a top six role on this team, and he seems more so like a bottom six player at this point for the San Jose Sharks, because he just hasn't really been doing enough when on the ice, which is the very same thing that the Detroit Red Wings had with him when he was on that team, and one of the reasons why he departed Detroit for San Jose was to try and get this new start, but it hasn't really amounted to much. And then the final player here is, of course, Luke Kunin, the other player on this wing, and I tweeted this out during the game that Luke Kunin seems to be the new Noah Gregor, and the comparison that I'm drawing there is that Noah Gregor was known while on the San Jose Sharks for being a player who could get tons and tons of chances, but could never really bury on those opportunities. But I also mentioned that Kunin was like a worse version of Noah Gregor, because the thing about Gregor is that he could create those chances for himself. It would be like multiple breakaways or one-on-one opportunities that Gregor would miss out on, but Kunin is usually just benefiting off of the other great plays from other players. And while there is a certain note of confidence that needs to be given to him just because he is getting in position to get those great chances, the fact that basically none of them are actually getting buried is not so much a notch in his cap. So a bit of a weird choice to continue to have him in the top six. Hopefully once the Sharks get more healthy, with of course Duclair coming back in the lineup hopefully soon, as well as Barabanov and Couture eventually, he's a player who gets bumped down and goes back to that fourth line role that we saw him at the beginning of the Oilers game, where I thought he did decent enough in. When it comes to the third line, we had our extra addition into the lineup with Duclair stepping out. It was Oscar Lindblom, who interestingly enough gets the call up from the San Jose Barracuda. Now Lindblom, you might think, oh, was he lighting it up in the minor leagues with the Barracuda? Well, not exactly. In the 8 games that he played with them, he had a grand total of 2 points, 1 goal, and 1 assist. For comparison's sake, one of the highest scorer on the Barracuda is Danil Gushin, who I believe coming into tonight's game, I believe the Barracuda did play, had 13 or so points, so 6 times, more than 6 times what Lindblom has. So the big question, I guess, at that point is why not call up Gushin, but I understand likely the reasoning is, for one thing, we already know that Mike Grier is the type of guy who likes to keep the prospects boiling as much as possible in the below leagues and not so much in the NHL, so it's very possible Gushin gets primarily the entire season, maybe a couple of games up in the NHL, but most of the season will likely find himself in the AHL. We also know that David Quinn is much more likely to trust a veteran player than a rookie player, and while Lindblom isn't exactly a grizzled veteran, he does have a few NHL seasons under his belt, and so even though there's not going to be much offense coming from Lindblom, and you would think that's what the Sharks would need considering their terrible offensive numbers, he is, I guess, more responsible defensively. When it comes to tonight's game, in general, Lindblom didn't really do anything, was his usual invisible self, completely taking up the mantle of what he was doing exactly this last season. So I guess nothing has changed, and we shouldn't really be surprised that nothing has changed, I guess. When it comes to the 2 other players on this line, Sturm and LeBanc, I thought they had a couple of okay shifts between them, but nothing super major, I would say. So okay game, I guess. Again, we're evaluating all of these players only on the first couple of periods, pretty much, and not so much on the third period where everybody was bad. And then when it comes to the 4th line, I was relatively surprised to see Carpenter get bumped back down to the 4th line. Perhaps they didn't have a better option at center here, though they technically could have called up Bordeleau as another option had they wanted to, but Carpenter stays on the 4th line where he didn't really have much success. This 4th line, I would say they were better and more apparent than they were last game, at least in the early parts of last game when it was Smith, Carpenter, and Cunnin, but nothing super consistent. Hoffman did find himself here on the 4th line, which was relatively surprising. I thought he would be the one coming out of the lineup, but I guess since Duclair had to step out due to health reasons, they kind of have to keep Hoffman in. Hoffman was better than yesterday, where he was just absolutely terrible, the worst player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks, but again, there's not really much doing here. When it comes to then the defensive side of things, let us talk once more about Calen Addison, as again the spotlight I would say is not as bright on him, but still certainly on him since it's his 2nd game with the San Jose Sharks. Yesterday I pointed out how you could tell he has those offensive instincts, but he didn't exactly get to show them all that much against the Oilers, but his defensive play was a bit better than expected. Here tonight, not so much the case. Addison struggled heavily in his own zone, just kind of floating around a bit. There was this one goal, I believe this one happened in the 3rd period, where it was very, very early season San Jose Shark X-esque. Addison floats to the middle of the zone, completely abandoning the right side, which allowed Martinez all the time in the world, I believe it was Martinez all the time in the world, to take his shot and just easily score it in that position because nobody's covering for where Addison is kind of moving towards for whatever reason. And then on the 3rd goal of the game, which was a shorthanded one from William Karlsson, we see Addison defending in a 2-on-2 situation, so not the 2-on-1 where the defenseman doesn't have much of a chance, a 2-on-2, and he misses his hit on Jack Eichel along the boards, which turns this into a down low 2-on-1 that the Golden Knights are able to capitalize. So Addison is the primary reason for why the Sharks fell behind 3-0 and then 4-0 in this game. So definitely a pretty bad outing for him. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, also not the best of outings, and Ferraro was also kind of struggling in yesterday's game as well. Ferraro was a player who actually started the season decently, was one of the best defensemen for the San Jose Sharks in the early parts of the year when the Sharks as a whole were still struggling. So it's sad to see that now that the Sharks have been slightly picking up the pace, that Ferraro is kind of reverting to what he was last season and really the past couple of seasons. When it comes to the second pairing here of Vlasic and Burrows, I actually thought this pairing was a bit better, in fact, which was definitely rather surprising to see Vlasic go from being against the worst team in the league, though I guess the speedy Oilers team was difficult to handle, to the best team in the league and actually have an improved performance was definitely something. I actually had not really many issues with Vlasic's game tonight, so that's definitely a positive, and the same would go for Kyle Burroughs. When it comes to the third pairing, there were definitely a few issues here, in particular with Okhotyuk. He was very good in the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers. Here tonight, definitely a lot more misses, definitely some really bad turnovers in his own zone, which was somewhat sad to see, but not all that unexpected either from still a very young defenseman who, again, I've mentioned this multiple times, is playing against the best team, the Stanley Cup champions from last season. When it comes to his defensive partner Ruda, though, he continues his redemption tour, continues to just get a bit by bit better and be a steady presence for the Sharks on the third pairing. And then finally we have the goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen, and as I mentioned early on, in the first couple of periods the Sharks didn't give up a ton of great grade A opportunities to the Vegas Golden Knights, and yet they found themselves behind 2-0, primarily due to the fact that Kähkönen didn't really play all that well on these two goals. The Pietrangelo one, he heavily overplays his hand on the wraparound, and then the Martinez one, it's through a bit of traffic for sure, but it's also from the point. It's relatively low down, and I don't think it actually deflected. So Kähkönen probably could have had these two saves, and while he did have a couple of good saves in this game, at the end of the day, it's one where, he didn't have to stand on his head, and he would have had to stand on his head, but he didn't stand on his head. He lets in 5 goals, and it's just not nearly as good as what we are seeing from the Sharks' other goaltender, Mackenzie Blackwood, so he continues to slip further and further down the depth charts, which is basically just me saying that he's no longer going to be the starter for this team, and Blackwood is likely to take over if he hasn't already. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, where they'll be taking on the Anaheim Ducks. Now, the Ducks were the last place team from last season, but they've been significantly better this year, not top of the standings or anything, but middle of the pack, which has been a surprising look for many. And so the Sharks, who are now taking up the mantle of the new last place team from the Anaheim Ducks, will see if they can get back in the win column or if the losses shall continue. Class dismissed.